Yep. Good afternoon, everyone. I want to welcome you to the first webinar of the new year titled Optimizing Your Supply Chain for Export Success. With us today, we have a real expert in that field joining us. His name is Doug Gardner, and he is part of the Arkansas Economic Development Commission and Arkansas Manufacturing Solutions. In fact, they are also our sponsors, not only for this webinar, but for the year. We are extremely grateful for all that they do to help us contribute to the exporting world here in Arkansas and outside of its borders. Doug, thanks for being here today with us and educating us going forward. I'd also like to recognize another pillar of the supply chain community that is joining us as a participant today, Dr. Mark Scott. He is the Associate Department Chair with the J.B. Hunt Department of Supply Chain Management and the Sam Walton College of Business at the University of Arkansas. Dr. Scott, thanks so much for joining us today, and we look forward to getting to know you and working together in the future.
Very cool.
Yeah, I agree. I'm excited about that relationship. For those of you that don't know, my name is Jonathan Bricker, and I'm the chair of the Arkansas District Export Council. In my primary role, I work for Regions Bank, and I'm located in Bentonville, Arkansas. My banking career started off as international business development, and now I'm a commercial lender with a focus on helping commercial and industrial businesses located in Arkansas. I really appreciate you all joining us today. For those of you that aren't quite sure who the DEC is and what we do, allow me to do a brief introduction. We're a private, nonprofit organization that brings together experienced international business people with potential exporters. Each DEC member has been appointed by the U.S. Secretary of Commerce because of their real-world expertise in international trade. We have a ton of experience within our council in many different sectors. Now, having said that, we don't know all the answers, but we can introduce you to someone who does. We are a community of connections within the exporting world. My hope for the day is that you walk away from this webinar with a little bit more confidence in your exporting abilities. And if you have any questions throughout the webinar and you don't feel comfortable asking it here, I invite you to reach out to us on our website at exportarkansas.org, and we'll have one of our members reach out to you. There, you can also sign up for our monthly newsletter, which is chock full of pertinent international news and trade show opportunities. Before we begin, I'd like to ask everyone to kind of keep themselves on mute and either raise your hands or put your question in the chat if you do have a question. That way we don't have any background noise interrupting our speakers. So I appreciate everyone's help with that. I'll introduce everyone to your educator and moderator this afternoon, Mr. Rudy Ortiz. Rudy is the previous chairman of the DEC, and he's the owner of Strategic Business Services, LLC, where he helps companies in a wide variety of international business and exporting needs. Rudy assists companies entering into new markets and is a U.S. partner of Global Market Entry Consultant, which is a global group of market entry experts throughout 32 different countries. He has an MBA in international business. He facilitates various export and supply chain related classes for the DEC and is a certified global business professional. For these reasons, he is the DEC's education chair. Rudy, thanks so much for hosting today, and I'll turn it over to you.
Jonathan, thank you so much as always. One of the things that Heidi and I were discussing just a little bit earlier before you jumped on to try to make sure that we get everyone's questions. Whenever we're in webinar mode, one can put a question in the chat or the Q&A, and to try to minimize the bouncing back and forth, if we can ask people to submit their questions in the Q&A as opposed to the chat this time around, would really appreciate it. It'll I think make things a little bit smoother. So once again, we really are very happy to have Doug Gardner, who is with the Arkansas Manufacturing Solutions, which is a department within the Arkansas the Arkansas Economic Development commission. And so Doug, he has a fantastic background, not only in supply chain management, but e-commerce, logistics, and he's also an industrial engineer. And very, very often, whenever you have a supply chain guy that really knows what his stuff is, he has some sort of engineering background, and that is certainly the case with Doug. He's got all sorts of technical skills and provides instruction through AMS, through Arkansas Manufacturing Solutions, about supply chain management. That's something that he does on a daily basis. And he also does analysis on people's supply chains to make sure that they have the witherall and really all the pieces and parts that are going to be needed to make sure that you do it correctly. Which is why we asked him today to be the main featured speaker on the topic of supply chain, and he'll be talking about this assessment tool along the way. So. I hope that you guys get a lot of information from the speaker and from the great information that he's going to provide. Provide. And so, Mr. Doug, if you will take it away, would really appreciate it.
Yeah, I will. I don't know how I didn't catch this, but my last name is actually Gardner, but you'll see a slide at the end with my contact information. So Dr. Scott, you should recognize the background screen behind me here. That is the University of Arkansas behind me here. So it should be very
Gardner
to you. So let's get rolling here. Hey, listen, everyone, thanks for joining here. Our goal is when we get to the end of this in about 52 minutes, is that you've learned a little bit from us. Between Rudy and I, we've got almost 90 years of industry experience, and most of mine has all been in supply chain and operations management and engineering. So let's get going here. Let's just jump right into this. Put this in presentation mode. Okay. All right, let's go. So a little bit of humor to get it started, and then we're gonna roll pretty fast. And as Rudy said, I've asked that we hold questions until the end. So please write them down. I mean, if you can indicate what slide we were on or what topic it was, more than happy to answer them at the end or even after the webinar. But this allows us to kind of get into our flow here, and we're going to cover a lot of material, and I hope you find it very helpful. So you got two people here talking. One of them says, hey, we could increase our annual revenue by 30% by exporting. And that is not uncommon, especially when a small to medium-sized company takes that step to moving into exporting. The other lady says, wow, that sounds like a great idea. And then she comes back and says, hey, but wait a minute, don't we have current challenges with inventory accuracy, supplier sourcing, and operations efficiencies? So our message today for those of you who are in manufacturing and production and either are exporting or looking to export is look before you leap. And we'll talk a lot more about, what do we mean by that? So because exporting before you are operationally ready could put your company at risk. And I'll also say in that same vein, any sort of increase of 20 to 30% in your outbound volume, if you're not ready for it operationally, whether it's exporting or anything else, maybe a large customer that you get, can definitely put your company at risk if you're not ready for it. So what we're going to talk about today, this is the theme of the webinar, optimize your supply chain for export success. And we're gonna paint a little bit of a dismal picture here early on, but then we're gonna get right to, well, how can we help, and what can we do to help you understand if you've got any challenges in your supply chain. So that's where we put that little blurb up there. Hey, let us help guide you here. So I want to talk to you a little bit about supply chain. So for those Americans who didn't know what supply chain was before COVID, I think most Americans know what supply chain is now. So as of the end of 2021, I think everyone knew what supply chain was because there were some major disruptions in the global supply chain, as all of us know. So I want to talk about supply chain. So if you kind of think about it, if you can see my clicker here, supply chain is really, if you kind of envision truly a chain, and each one of these is a link in the chain. And really that term started about 40 years ago, really. logistics and supply chain. So each of these is a major link. So as we move from suppliers to transportation, to manufacturers, to distributors, to retailers, to the customer, those are chains. And if any of those break or are under stress, it can certainly put the flow to the end user in jeopardy, as all of us know from COVID. So there's going to be actually the more important thing is there are 7 main functions in the supply chain that we're going to focus on. And one of them is business planning, which we'll talk more about, supplier management. And again, I've got these arrows going all the way across the supply chain because most of these apply all the way across. So business planning, supplier management, inventory management, transportation management. So you got transportation all the way through the supply chain. Risk management, you got risk all the way through. Operations management and technology. We do add technology here because it is so critical in today's supply chain, and we'll talk a little bit more about that here in just a bit. So again, it's critical to assess, and the word I really want to stress is assess, because we're going to talk about the last 10 minutes of this webinar today is, so you've told me all this stuff, so what can you do to help me? We have created and we are offering through the Arkansas Economic Development Commission. Actually, I worked with a vendor out of Boise, Idaho to develop an online supply chain assessment that we're going to talk to you about at the end here on being able to assess as a company, being able to assess where you may have gaps, challenges, and risk in your supply chain. But it's critical to assess those 7 key supply chain functions. So I just kind of did a copy paste from that earlier slide right there. So we're going to talk about all 7 of those. So let's get going here on this. The intent of the next 7 slides is we're going to cover each of these 7 areas, these functions in a supply chain, starting with business planning. And I'm going to drill in on 4 or 5 of them. The assessment tool actually will capture anywhere from 12 to 20 questions in each one of these areas. And we'll talk more about that here in just a second, but we're going to fly pretty high over these. So business planning. Does your company have a mission and a vision? For those of you who are in very large companies, you would say, well, sure, we do. A lot of small and medium-sized companies either don't know they need one, don't have enough time to put one together, or whatever the reason is. But do you have a mission and vision? Do you have a strategic plan? So are you looking far enough ahead, 3 to 5 years, probably no more than 5 years, on where you want to be? Do you know your strengths as a company? Do you know your weaknesses, your opportunities, your threats? That's called SWOT in the business world. Have you done a SWOT analysis? Do you know your total costs, variable and fixed costs? We'll talk a little bit more about that here in just a bit. So a little bit too far. So Rudy, let's jump in here and maybe spend a couple minutes on, from our experiences in industry, if you don't have a good plan for these 4 areas here, how that can really put challenges on your execution operationally.
Sure thing, and I'd love to be able to talk about some of these as well. So, the mission, you hear. It's just kind of become buzzwords, right? Mission and vision, and in many times, in many cases, people just kind of slap something together. But the knowing what the mission of the company is for every company is really, really important, because you can think of the mission as sort of the North Star. If what you're trying to do is go in a specific direction, and I'll use the analogy of the North Star. So long as you keep an eye on the mission and the vision of the company, i.e., the North Star of the company, you can never get too far off track. But what I find is that a lot of people, maybe top management really understands the mission and vision, maybe middle management less so, and then the employees not at all, or like very, very low level. But it's really important that every person in the company understands the mission and vision of the company, so that as they're making decisions, and whether we're talking about top management or the janitor of the company, from stem to stern, everyone should understand what that is, so that as they're making decisions, should I do X or should I do Y? One of the things that you should be looking at, does this follow the mission and vision of the company? I.e., is it true? Does it add value? Does it push the mission further in terms of the decision that I'm making? Because it could very, very well be, and happens quite often, that the different departments are siloed and wind up making decisions that perhaps appear to be furthering the department's task, but in fact are actually moving the company in the wrong direction because the departments are siloed. A term that I developed called a glass silo. You've heard of the glass ceiling. Well, these are glass silos in the sense that they're not they're transparent. You can't always see that the departments are siloed, but in fact they're making decisions that are contrary to the mission and vision. Strategic. There's a saying that if you don't care where you wind up at, well, then any road will do. And obviously, as a company, and in particular in terms of the mission and vision, we need to know, what is the end goal of the company, and that way we're constantly monitoring the path that we're taking, the tactical acts that we're taking, the steps that we're taking to accomplish the strategic plan and the mission or vision of the company. But it starts with a strategy plan. Once again, if you don't have a really good understanding of what the mission and vision, and develop the strategic plan to fulfill that mission and vision, then the likelihood that you're going to wind up where you wanted is really, really small.
And I think, I mean, I say it hierarchically, but in regards to, so it starts with the mission and vision, and these really are in sequence, and then that moves into what that strategic plan is, and Rudy touched on that. And then Rudy, the term he said is tactical, is then you move into the tactical plan. So a strategic plan is 3 to 5 years out. A tactical plan might be an annual plan of what you plan to do for that year. So a lot of companies right now are executing their tactical plan. It's January. They probably put it together in October of the year before. But we're going to have to jump off this. We can spend hours with you. Rudy he's in this strategic planning world. He understands it. It is just so critical. We call this business planning. Again, SWOT analysis. It's very critical to understand, to really sit around as an owner and your leaders of your company and say, where are we strong? And where do we have threats? And then total cost, we'll talk a little bit more about total cost. It's so critical to understand the total costs in your company in order to price your goods and services correctly, and to be able to make a profit. And most companies are in business to make a profit. So let's jump on from business planning. By the way, and I think I mentioned this earlier, in the assessment that we'll talk about here in just a bit, we actually ask about 20 questions, starting with mission and vision, and Rudy touched on it. Do you have a mission and vision? Second question is, has that mission and vision been communicated to all levels of your company? It's so critical. I worked for years for Hallmark Cards in Kansas City, and we had our mission and vision on a laminated piece of, it was about 2 inches by 1.5 inches, and we carried it in our notebooks. Supplier management. Let's talk about supplier management. We're going to, again, spend about 3 or 4 minutes on this slide and cover the highlights of what we mean by supplier management. Again, it's one of those 7 functions that goes through a supply chain that you got to get it right, or as we found out in COVID, you don't have good supplier management, it could be a major challenge. So do you have contingency plans for alternative suppliers? So if you have a supplier right now that gets hit by a tornado, or a hurricane comes into Louisiana and wipes them out, or if there's a strike on the West Coast and they can't get goods to you, do you have a contingency plan for an alternative supplier? Do you know the financial strength of your key suppliers? And that this is one normally, for the most part, small to medium-sized companies, especially in the state of Arkansas, will say, no, we really don't. And it's so critical, especially the ones that provide some really key goods for your company. Do you really know what the financial strength of that supplier is? Do you know which products you produce that may have a single source supplier? We also call that a single thread. So you've got a product a major product that you produce, and you've got one supplier. Do you know which products those are? Do you provide feedback to your suppliers when you have quality problems with their stuff that's coming in your back door? And then lastly, do you audit POs against your supplier invoices? So you're popping POs to your suppliers, they're shipping stuff in and they're invoicing you. Are you comparing your PO to your invoices to make sure they're in alignment? So those are 5 critical pieces. And Rudy, again, let's jump in, maybe spend a couple of minutes on some of these that off the top of your head you think are critical from an experience standpoint.
Absolutely. So during COVID, one of the things that we found was, and I'm going to use an actual example. Somebody's making fans, oscillating fans, the kind that blow air so that you can get cooled down, right? And they were unable to get the blade part. They had all the other stuff, but they were unable to get the blade part because the supplier, they had a single source supplier that made the blades. And so this company had to shut down and lay off all their employees because they had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these fans that were no more than paperweights because they did not have the blade to be able to finish the manufacturing of the product that they sold. And so that's a really important part, and something that really comes into play when you have a single source supplier. The other thing is, in many cases, companies will pay very close attention to those parts that are maybe larger or more expensive, or there's something about them. But sometimes something as simple as a very inexpensive but unique screw can just really muck up the works as well. And so you have to really look at every single piece. Even though this is a 2-cent screw, is there something unusual about it that would cause a difficulty in acquiring it readily? Okay, maybe even being able to go to Home Depot and getting it because there's just no other choice, right? And so paying attention to the number of suppliers that you have, and how critical or how difficult it is to be able to get these products is critically important.
And so you mentioned the blades. I mean, I'm sure those of you on the call can probably also think and hear, or you've heard of examples, but years ago we had a situation where we ran out of packaging material. So a product, we had all the pieces and parts to make the part, but we didn't have a specific label that our customer required. We ran out of it. And so we're stalled for about, I think, 2 or 3 days. We were stalled. So in something as simple as that, packaging or labeling material, not only the pieces and parts to make your product, but what you package and ship them with. So Rudy did touch on several things here on the single source supplier, the contingency plans on the supplier. Again, we'll just real quickly finish this off. Quality. So if you have a quality concern, so you receive a shipment from a supplier and you got a bunch of damaged stuff, normally you always would communicate back to them. But if it's just something simple that maybe their packaging was crushed, or maybe you had to do just a little bit of rework on it, but it just keeps happening and keeps happening and keeps happening, that's a real drag on your operations on your receiving dock. And say it takes you another hour every time you receive a shipment from the supplier, and this happens 15 to 20 times a year. I mean, that's 20 to 25 hours at $40 an hour for fully burdened, $8,000 to $10,000 you just ate because you had a supplier with a quality problem that you didn't address. So let's move on. Supplier management. Again, in that assessment we'll talk about here in just a bit, we've got to think about 20 questions we ask about. How good are you at supplier management? Inventory management's a big one. And we spend quite a bit of time on the assessment talking about inventory management. So inventory needs to be very tightly linked to your sales goals. So for instance, we're talking about exporting here and being able to get good operationally first before you start to export. Do you know your sales goals for exporting? So yeah, I do. We're hoping to increase our sales in 2026 by 20% by exporting to India. So from an inventory standpoint, are you tightly linking what your inventory needs would be? So for all the parts and pieces to support those sales goals. Do you have adequate systems to manage and track your inventory? And those of you on the call that are a small or mid-sized company, or you know of someone who runs a small to mid-sized company, it is not uncommon for a small company to still manage their inventory on a spreadsheet. Now, there are several medium-sized and obviously the large companies, tracking it in an ERP system, but small to medium-sized companies who are the ones that we're really focused on making sure operationally they're ready to increase volumes like for exporting. Do they have adequate systems in place, whatever that system might be, whether it's a spreadsheet or whether it's a very small, simple ERP? Do you have a focus on demand planning to determine inventory needs? And that term demand planning really started in industry probably 20 years ago, 15 to 20 years ago. Demand planning is, you think of demand. So demand is a customer demanding your goods. And so planning to make sure you have proper inventory to support that demand is what demand planning is. It's inventory management or demand planning. So amount and timing. So it's not only do you feel you have the right amount, but is it getting to your facility at the right time to support the demand? Inventory decisions are very, very tightly tied to financial targets of working capital and earnings before interest and taxes. And Rudy and I talked about this one last week. Inventory in a lot of cases, if not most, for a small to medium-sized manufacturer, or really even a larger one, it can be in the top 3 entries on a balance sheet. So it's a big deal. And working capital that is needed to provide inventory or to buy inventory is a big deal from a financial planning standpoint. So are your inventory decisions tightly tied to your financial targets? So if you've got the people in the finance department setting targets for working capital and earnings before interest and taxes, are they tightly linked with your operations group on inventory decisions? So again, Rudy, jump in here. Let's spend a couple minutes on some experience that you've had.
Yeah, I spend a lot of time helping clients get additional capital so they can grow. I mean, my company focuses on helping companies grow, right? And capital, or the amount of capital or access to capital, is the one of the chief drivers of whether you can grow your company or not. And so a lot of times what will happen is people are trying to grow the company, but they don't have, maybe their financial statements are not appropriate. They're not bankable. And not because the company itself is not making money, but because the financial statements do not reflect that they're making enough money to take on additional debt. And and when you're trying to get working capital to buy, more widgets, more materials, more equipment, you're going to have access to capital. And so one of the things that you need to do is be well prepared to be able to go to the bank and ask, assuming that you already have a line of credit, that to increase the line of credit in order to be able to once again to buy more materials, maybe even buy some sort of equipment or whatever. At the end of the day, capital is just a key component of being able to grow your company. And so when you're making decisions about we're gonna grow our business, our sales by 20%, a chief component in terms of being able to accomplish that is having access to capital.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is really a topic, we're going to jump off of it right now, but this is one we ask about 25 questions on, because also within inventory management, how well internally are you managing your inventory? And do you know what product and parts and pieces are what we call dead inventory? So they're just taking up space and you're walking by them every day. So that's kind of falls under the operational piece of this component. But inventory is tied to financials, it's tied to operations, it's tied to a lot of stuff. It's tied to your suppliers. So inventory is a big, big deal, and inventory management is a critical deal that, as Rudy said, we spend a lot of time with our clients on. Transportation management, we'll talk a little bit about transportation management. Again, you think of that supply chain, moving across the supply chain, call it logistics, call it transportation, call it what you might, but you're having to move stuff across that supply chain, and that's transportation. Do you know if your transportation solutions, both the inbound transportation into your facilities and the outbound to your customers, are the most cost-effective and reliable? I mean, do you truly know that? Do you audit your inbound and outbound freight bills? So a carrier ships stuff to you, or a carrier takes it away, they bill you. Are you occasionally auditing those to make sure they're right? Do you have contingency plans for any service disruptions for inbound or outbound? It kind of seems like a question that would just be logical, but a lot of times companies don't. They kind of fall asleep at the switch and everything's working great until it's not. Do you have good relations with international shipping resources? I'm going to have Rudy touch a little bit on this one, but again, this webinar is about operationally getting your house in order so that you can support increases in volume due to exporting. So before you would take that leap, do you have good relations with international shipping resources? Yes or no? So Rudy, jump in here. Let's spend a couple minutes.
Yeah, and actually this is tied to something that we talked about just a little while ago. So like, why do people only have one supplier, whether it's supplier of widgets or whether it's supplier of shipping capabilities, right? Well, generally, I think the reason they do it is because they think that they're going to get the best deal, the lowest cost if they give one supplier all the business, right? And whether that's the shipping part of it or whether that's the widget buying part of it. But the reality is that you're really risking your entire company by having only one supplier of X, whatever that happens to be. And the smart thing to do, and it's something that I really push very hard because COVID showed us just how critical it is to have multiple suppliers, whether it's multiple suppliers of widgets or whether it's multiple suppliers of, in this case, shipping, and have developing relationships. Like, let's just take the shipping just for example, is to have at least a couple of shipping suppliers. And so maybe you give one of them more than the other, but you always want to have two, whether we're talking about buying widgets or whether we're talking about buying shipping services. We want to have two, and you may not get the very cheapest account from that, but the reality is that if for whatever reason one supplier cannot service you for whatever the reason is, you already have a relationship and you already know that the supplier can in fact perform because they are already performing for you, as opposed to Bob, for whatever reason, can't do it anymore. And now it might take months to find somebody who can replace Bob and make the widget, provide the shipping, whatever it happens to be. And so don't risk your company, which is exactly what you're doing when you only have one supplier. Have at least two and preferably three.
Yeah, good point. Just a couple of add-ons on this as I'm processing as you're talking here, Rudy. It's not uncommon, and I think all of us would know this, that a supplier would say, "Hey, if I can get all of your volume, I'll give you a 10% discount.
Right.
Give it all to me."
Yeah.
It's tempting. It's very tempting. But to Rudy's point, it's extremely risky. The other point on this is that Rudy talks about having at least two suppliers, which is great coaching and guidance. The other thing is on that is you might have another supplier or suppliers kind of in the wings, so that you've done some research with them. You know that they're capable. You may even want to give them a little bit and test them out, but that you've got some kind of in waiting that are on your Rolodex right at the top that you could call and be able to start business with them because you know who they are. You've done financial analysis on them. You're not doing business with them right now, but they're kind of out there on the hook if you need them. You may not necessarily be using them, but they could potentially be a supplier in the future. So again, having those contingency plans, whether you're using more than one supplier or not, or you have some that you've at least researched that you could pull the trigger on and get in a moment's notice, so to speak.
Yeah. And Doug, there may be some situation where you could bring somebody on fairly quickly, but for instance, in terms of materials and parts and whatnot, that ain't one of them. I mean, you need to know that that person can make that screw exactly like what you're going to need, or that whatever it happens to be, or that the material that they're supplying is in fact exactly the kind of material that you need. Because once again, that can take months to be able
Yeah,
to ascertain, right? And so, your company will go broke in that period of time. So having somebody who is already supplying you 15, 20% of the materials, and another guy who's supplying, 35, 40% of the materials, that way, if the guy who's doing the 35, 40%, for whatever reason, he is either diminished or is out of the game, you can already very quickly turn to the other guy who's supplying 15, 20% and say, hey, Bob, can you increase that to 40%? And you already know they can perform because they are already performing for you. And the
yeah,
relationship is there.
yeah, absolutely. And again, we're going to jump off this, but yeah, we could go on forever on this one, but we're talking about suppliers because really transportation providers are suppliers, right? So to Rudy's point, they are kind of commingled. We're talking about transportation management, but it kind of falls under supplier management also. But also in regards to that is if you have an easy scenario here, if you have a supplier of widgets and 50% of them are coming from the ABC company and 50% of them are coming from the XYZ company, I think it's very good, it's very important to communicate to both of those companies is what if I doubled my volume to you, to either one of you? Would you have the internal capacity to handle
Hmm.
it? And prove it to me that you have that internal capacity to handle it. Because if they don't, if ABC goes broke and now you double the request or demand to a supplier that can't hit it, even though they're a supplier for you right now, you're still sunk. So you might want to go in that case is go with 3 suppliers. So
That's right.
again, we can talk a lot, which is all about contingency planning. And folks, I'm preaching to the choir to a lot of you. This takes time. It just takes time, and a lot of smaller companies don't have that time. But to Rudy's point, one of the very first slides we talked about before we jumped into this is if you're not properly prepared in your supply chain to increase volume, you could put your company at risk. And this is certainly one of those areas where you definitely can put your company at risk. And I think COVID proved to a lot of us that there were a lot of companies out there that weren't ready and they're no longer with us.
Yeah.
Risk management, yeah,
And one last thing, you can put your reputation at risk because you think you can perform, but you wind up not being able to perform because of the supplier, your supply chain, and all of a sudden, you're known as a guy who in fact does not perform.
absolutely right. Risk management, we've been talking a lot about risk here as we walk through this here, so we'll spend a little bit of time on this. But again, this is one of the 7 categories in the assessment. It's one of the major functions in a supply chain that is very, very critical. Do you have continuity plans for your facility or facilities, your equipment, and your system failures? So for instance, for those of you who don't know, so in May of this year, May of last year, excuse me, over actually Memorial Weekend, there was multiple tornadoes that came through Northwest Arkansas. One of them came right down the main drag of Rogers, Arkansas, which is right up just south of Bentonville, which is world headquarters for Walmart. And it did extensive destruction along that main drag coming into Rogers. And there are several businesses that will never come back. Now, if they had a contingency plan for moving to another facility, would they still have been able to do it? It's hard to know. But for instance, this stuff happens. So do you have a continuity plan for a facility? If you have a major piece of equipment in your facility and it fails, or if your systems fail, do you have a continuity plan so that you're not out of business? have you addressed cyber risk to head off security breaches? We touch on this just a little bit more on technology here in just a bit, but cyber risk, as all of us know, it's something that cannot be ignored. Does your master database have backup plans? So all of your client information in a database, a lot of small companies got it on a spreadsheet. Maybe it's on a server, maybe it's on a memory stick, maybe it's on a piece of paper. So your master database, which is all of your suppliers, all of your customers, all of the information on them, do you have backup plans? You know, larger companies are using, they're obviously in the cloud, but they're in multiple backups around the country where they have database backups. So if a server room gets wiped out in Seattle, Washington, that company that's storing your data in the cloud also has 3 or 4 other server rooms around the United States. So master database backups are a big deal. Leader succession planning, and again, under risk management. So your CEO dies in a car wreck. And I'm being a little bit radical there, but I mean, these things happen, or, you know, they unexpectedly get sick and miss a lot of work. Do you have a succession plan, or they leave? They pick up and give a 2-week notice or less, and they're gone. Do you have, for your key leaders in your company, even if you're a small company, your president, your operations VPs? Yeah, especially your small companies. Without a doubt, I went too far. So yeah, Rudy, jump in here. Let's spend maybe a minute or two, and then we'll jump on.
I want to talk about the master database just for a second, and that is your accounts receivable. I mean, the list that shows who owes you money. You know, if all of a sudden you get hacked and or something goes wrong with the system, and you don't know who owes you money, that can put you out of business for sure. We were talking about the facilities. I've known at least 3 different companies that had fires, and they were down for a year and a half or 2, and many of them never did recover. And so this sort of planning and having a backup plan is really important. The other thing in terms of cybersecurity and backup plans, a lot a lot of people don't understand that, well, yeah, they're backing up their hard drive, but it is hooked up to the internet. Well, that means that if somebody does a ransomware attack, they have that information as well, and wiped it out. And so you should never have your backup hard drive hooked up to the internet. The only time that you use the hard drive for the backup is while you're backing up, and then you unplug it. And maybe even have 2 of them, and one is taken to a secure site. In any case, this is real. This is not something that happens to big companies, or only big companies. It actually happens mostly to small companies and medium-sized companies, because they do not take the time or don't have the resources to do it the way that the big guys can do it.
Absolutely. And again, this takes time. And again, a small, medium-sized company is their day-to-day trying to run the business. And these are things that get ignored a lot of the times. And normally you're okay. I mean, normally these things don't happen. But if they do, are you, again, that slide at the very beginning, are you okay with gambling, so to speak, that if one of these things happens and you're not ready, that you're out of business? I'm going to speed this thing up because I want to spend time on the assessment. We've got 15 minutes left here, and I'm going to fly through the next 2 slides very fast. By the way, I think I saw a little bit on the chat a little bit ago that before I went into presentation mode here, that people were asking if this was going to be, if these slides were going to be available afterwards, and the answer is yes, and you'll have my contact information too. But operations management, do you have the capacity, throughput, space, and labor to handle peaks and future growth? Critical. If you're going to expand your volume, can you get it through? Do you have the space, square footage and cubic footage, and do you have the labor and management to increase that capacity to support it? Focus on reducing waste due to inefficient processes. Are you doing that? Do you have a focus now on reducing waste in labor, waste in materials? Because if you increase your outbound volume by 30%, and it's not linear, I found in the years is that if you increase volumes like that and you don't have a good process improvement in place, that it's not linear, that if I had 5% waste before and now I increase my volume, then I'll still have 5%. It might be more like 8 to 10% because you're just not ready for that increased volume. Do you have effective internal corrective action programs? So in your operation right now, if you find an error in your process flow, do you have a good corrective action program in place to fix it? Do you have adequate spare parts for all of your critical equipment? So if you've got a failure on third shift at 3 in the morning, do you have spare parts and do you have somebody that can install them? And do you have what we touch on workforce quite a bit in operations management assessment also, but do you have qualified hourly employees with the skills that are needed? So again, operations management, I think, has the most assessment questions. I think it's about 25 because it is critical. Internally, how are you operating? Are you effective? Are you efficient? Do you have the capacity? And then, Rudy, I think I'm going to jump right to the last slide here.
Let me just make one very quick comment, and that is inefficient processes. I have found over the 26 years that I've been doing this that the biggest stumbling block for a company to be able to grow is inefficient processes. They don't have the software or they don't have the systems in place. That is the differentiator between what is a mom and pop operation and a thriving business, is the development of systems. Otherwise, you continue to waste time and can't grow as a consequence of that.
Technology, we're going to jump through really quickly here, and then I want to talk to you all about the supply chain assessment here. Again, we've kind of painted these dismal pictures, and it's like, so how can you guys help me here? And that's really, we're building to that, believe me. Technology, so in the assessment, we talk about, do you have a robust business and shop floor operating system in place? A lot of times the answer is absolutely not. I don't have an ERP. But do you have, so what is your system? Is it a spreadsheet? What is your system to, and I call it robust. I mean, do you have one? In a lot of cases for a company that has 10 people working for them, but business and shop floor operating systems in place on how you operate on that shop floor and get stuff through in an efficient manner. Do you have up-to-date computer hardware in all your on-site locations? So, what is your computer hardware like? What are you using from a computer standpoint, and whether it's scanners or laptops or iPads, what is it that you're using, and is it clunky? Is it hand-me-downs, or is it state-of-the-art good stuff? Because again, if you increase your volumes by 20-30% and you don't have the proper computer hardware, or you're struggling with what you've currently got, it's going to be a challenge. Do you have a designated person who oversees all technology resources? When we ask that question to a small to medium-sized company, it's like, absolutely not. So those companies have a person that wears several hats. And what we find is that in order to successfully do a lot of the things we talk about in technology, whether it's automation, ERPs, whatever it might be, hardware, software, controls, if you don't have somebody that kind of oversees all that, it can be a major challenge to increase your volume where you need technology and proper technology to make that happen. Are you comfortable with your automation solutions? If you have them, again, a lot of the smaller companies don't, but if you don't, do you know what you potentially want? So your future needs, and again, as we all know, the state of Arkansas is no different than any other state in the union, is that getting people and getting qualified workforce is extreme in manual operations is extremely difficult. It's going to get more difficult And a lot of companies are thinking about automation, but we talk a lot, our group, because my background is around automation, is that, again, before you leap, truly understand what you're getting into when you move toward automation, and the burden it can provide, and the cost it can provide by going there. And we're not trying to scare people, but just saying, hey, I can't get enough people, I'm just going to automate. Think about that. And again, our group works a lot with customers on that. In fact, we've got a customer right now we're working with on automation solutions. Do you have access to operational and financial data? Is your operational and financial data, is it adequate to make decisions? And I put that under technology. Data is powerful. And for planning purposes, for forecasting purposes, for root cause analysis, et cetera, do you have access from a technology standpoint to good operational and financial data, not only to get it, but to save it, to store it, and to keep it safe? So that's the technology piece. I'm gonna go ahead and jump, Rudy, if you're okay. I've got 252, and because I really want to get into the assessment piece. Okay.
Yes, sir.
All right. So I came on board here about a year ago. Again, earlier I talked about I spent 45 years in industry, a lot of that in supply chain management, in warehousing, distribution, manufacturing. And so I came to work under a federal grant for the Arkansas Economic Development Commission. Actually, I'm an employee of the University of Arkansas under a subrecipient agreement. So that's why you see the University of Arkansas behind me on my picture. But one of the things that I really wanted to do in our state, and really was one of the guiding principles of the job I was taking on, which actually ends the end of May this year, was put together a supply chain assessment for the state of Arkansas. So we have done that, and it would be available to any Arkansas company. So if you are an Arkansas company out there and you're interested in this, or if you know someone who's an Arkansas company that would be interested in this, I'd be more than happy to talk to you. The last slide's got my contact information on it. But we put together a really cool tool, and we worked with a company out of Boise, Idaho, named Vessel. They're a startup, and they've been around about 5 years, but they're in this business of developing online surveys and online assessments, and we worked with them to develop this. But step one in this process is that company leaders are provided an online link to what we call a self-score of the assessment of these 7 categories that we just went through. So those of you who have ever used SurveyMonkey, very similar functionality. We just developed it and with Vessel and fine-tuned it to our need here in the state of Arkansas. So you would get an auto-generated email, no different than SurveyMonkey, and this is actually a screenshot of what one looks like. Helping manufacturers excel in every fact of business. We want to hear from you, and this talks about the supply chain assessment, and click on the evaluation. It takes you right into the assessment. So here it is. And if you look across the top, section 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, we changed that actually in the content of our tool where it actually has business planning and supplier management. It's got them across here. But this one's clicked on section 1, which is business planning. It's got 17 questions. It is a 1 to 5. So I strongly disagree, which would actually end up being a 1 in the tally of the data. 2, I strongly agree, which would be a 5. Or what we do on this is if you got someone that this went to in your company that they really don't deal with business planning, and that oftentimes is the case, that's normally the C-suite or the owners deal with business planning, where an inventory manager might not, they can skip the entire category, because what we don't want them to do is just go through and guess, or go through and just kind of haphazardly assign values to it, so they can skip the whole category. So again, this is a custom design assessment for us. We've been using it now for about 3 months. We love it. Step 2, a small team from our group, so from Arkansas Manufacturing Solutions, would go on site. So we've captured the data that came in. We are seeing where they've got a lot of 1s, which I'm not very good at this, to a lot of 5s, I'm really good at this, or anything in the middle. So we're seeing the ones that they might be at risk or have gaps on. And we actually then go on site and we walk through their operations and spend a lot of time with them, understanding what their flow is, and also talk to their people. And then we really sit down and roll up our sleeves with them and talk about the assessment, and especially the ones where they have rated themselves through the self-assessment rather low. They're going to know a lot more about their business than I or anybody else coming from the outside would know. So they've done this self-assessment, and we really sit down and really start understanding more about what's causing that gap and that weakness, and what their interest level might be to address it. Or maybe they say, I get it. I know I got a problem in that area, but I got bigger fish to fry somewhere else. That's fine. We'll move on to the second topic, but this gives us an opportunity to sit down face to face. It's extremely valuable with data that they gave us through the assessment. Step 3 then is we'll actually build a report, and I'll show you some snippets of it here in just a bit. It's a really cool, very professional report that will, it'll not only focus on where they've got challenges, but it'll also focus on where they're doing a really, really good job. So, where they've rated themselves a 4 or a 5, and we've gone on site with them and we're like, you really are strong at this. Is there any way that in a SWOT world, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, or threats, you always want to try and take your strengths and offset your weaknesses if you can. So those areas where they're very strong at, is there any way we can leverage what they're doing right there with some of these areas where they're not doing so good? So we focus on what their best practices are, and then we obviously point out their greatest needs, their risk, and their gaps. And that report kind of looks like this, and we'll wrap this thing up here in just about a minute here. But I actually blacked out. This is an actual report. I blacked out the customer here, but that went out on November 20th of last year. And this is what the front cover looks like. It would have the company logo right here. This is our logo right here. And then kind of the cover letter. So kind of a professional cover. And then we jump right into, when we developed this with Vessel, I was adamant about having an executive summary that we right up front in this report. I think actually it's page 4, which is a little bit further down than where I wanted it to be. But when this report goes out, because it is about 20 pages and it's in PDF that goes to them. But if you're a CEO or you're an owner, you're not going to go through 20 pages. So give me an executive summary. This is the executive summary right here of this company, and it shows all 7 of these where they rated. So on a scale of 1 to 5 business planning, they were a 2.7. And then they had a 3.1 and all the way down to, so you can kind of immediately see if you're an owner, look at this, and this is down here around 1.5, you're like, what in the world? I want to know more about that. So executive summary, then we can actually get and drill into, so this is the business planning section. So let me go back. So here was business planning at 2.7. Then we can drill down into business planning. We can drill down into what the questions are if they rated themselves less than a 3. And we put those in kind of an at-risk category. So in this case, and this is real data, we have proper succession plans in place for management and leaders. They rated themselves a 2.8. We want to talk to them about that. So this really gives us an opportunity when we go on site to really home in and focus on these areas that they assess themselves on. And again, this is just business planning right here. And then finally, we move into, okay, so what are we going to do about it? You pointed out all these areas where we've got challenges, and we move on into a future state analysis with them. And I didn't put a lot of more pages on this because I just wanted to generally talk to you about kind of what the series and the flow of that report looks like, moving all the way into solutions and recommended action. And that all comes through this assessment process. So that's something we offer. The state offers right now, it's free for any Arkansas company. So again, any of you who are Arkansas company or know of an Arkansas company, be more than happy to talk to you about that. And this is me right here.
Doug, that's fantastic. Free. Oh my goodness. I will tell you that if you went to a for-profit company, you're probably looking at 18 to 20,000. Yeah, so that's fantastic, man. And I will tell you that the AMS, the guys there are professionals. They They love what they do. They're extremely good at what they do, and I can highly recommend that you work with them. One last thing, we sometimes we throw out acronyms. We talked about ERP. An ERP is an enterprise resource planning tool, and it's software that allows you to streamline and automate the core functions of the company. So ERPs are really, really important in terms of developing systems to be able to grow the company efficiently.
Guys, real quick, there's a couple of questions in the Q&A section here. I'll read them off to you. Thanks, Doug, for the great presentation. Can attendance of the webinar receive the link to online assessment 25 questions?
Yeah, I can give it to you in Excel format.
Okay. And then, yeah, so Ms. Heidi, let's make a note of who's asking the question. And then the other question in here is, you suggested having multiple suppliers and multiple shippers. Couldn't this be difficult for small and medium-sized firms? Are there any suggestions for that?
No, I don't think it would be particularly more difficult for a small company than a larger company. I think once again the driver of the decision to use one supplier of X is that they're hoping to be able to get the best rate, the lowest cost, but once again at the extremely high risk of going out of business or damaging your company significantly by having that one supplier. So no, I don't think it's any more difficult for a small company than it is for a large company.
I will tell you just real quickly on this one. Again, I know we're over time, but in regards to that question right there, we're also very tied into, in the state of Arkansas, home base. Well, obviously the JB Hunt Company is home base, very large, if not one of the largest transportation companies in the world. But also ArcBest is out of Fort Smith. They're headquartered in Fort Smith, and we've got a great working relationship with them also. There's tools that are out there that they provide and for free. On being able to rate shop in the LTL world, being able to rate shop and being understand what your options might be. Because if you're in a very small town in rural Arkansas, your options might be a little bit less than, or a little bit less than what your options might even be. But we can help guide you and give you resources to guide you toward what the bigger picture of your options might be for companies to talk to.
All right. Okay, well, those are the two questions that I see. We'll get that email address for you, Doug, for you to be able to send that online assessment. And again, if anybody has any other questions or want to reach out to, not to throw you under the bus, Doug, but if they want to reach out to you directly, I don't want to blow up your email, but that was a lot of really good information. So I'm thinking you should be receiving some emails going forward.
Yeah, I'm more than happy to talk, share, teach, learn with any of you.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, thanks again for doing that. And thanks again to our sponsors, the Arkansas Economic Development Commission and Arkansas Manufacturing Solutions, for allowing us to put this webinar on. Couple of things. There's the contact information on your screen for Doug, Rudy, and myself, and Miss Heidi. We'll have the recording on our YouTube channel. And we'll also have the slides available to be sent out to you. We've got a quick survey here that shouldn't take but a few seconds. I know everybody's ready to get off here, but we'd love to know how we're doing, how we might be able to improve, and what you think of it. So if you would take a few seconds to answer that for us, we'd be extremely grateful. And Miss Heidi, are there any other slides that we need?
Apparently not.
No.
Okay. All right. Well, Well, thank you all for joining us today. Hope to see you all again at the next webinar. Have a great rest of your week.